Silent night, bloody night.
Snow fell heavily on the small town of Clearwater, blanketing it in an eerie silence. Christmas lights twinkled on the houses lining the streets, but they seemed muted, dimmed by the oppressive storm. At the edge of town, where the forest loomed dark and ancient, stood the Stevens home, a charming two-story house adorned with wreaths and garlands. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire battled against the unease creeping into the corners of the cozy living room. Emily Stevens, 17 and full of holiday spirit, placed the finishing touches on the Christmas tree.
Her parents, James and Lucy, watched from the couch, their mugs of cocoa steaming in their hands.
The family dog, Max, lay curled near the fire, snoring softly. "It's perfect," Emily said, stepping back to admire her work.
"What do you think?" James smiled. "You've outdone yourself, kiddo. It's like something out of a catalog."
Lucy chuckled, but before she could respond, the lights flickered.
Everyone froze.
The fire's glow seemed to stretch into the shadows as the electricity gave a final sputter and went out entirely. "Storm's worse than they said it'd be," James muttered, setting his mug down. "I'll grab some candles." As James moved toward the kitchen, Max perked up, his ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Emily crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears.
"What's wrong, boy?" she whispered. Max's growl grew louder as his gaze fixed on the front door. Lucy frowned. "Did you hear that?"
Emily listened, straining to hear beyond the storm. A faint scratching sound reached her ears, growing more insistent with each passing second.
It was coming from the front door.
"Probably the wind," James called from the kitchen, his voice too casual to be convincing. "Doesn't sound like the wind," Emily said, standing. She hesitated before walking to the door. Her hand trembled as she unlocked it and pulled it open. The cold wind howled, scattering snow across the threshold.
No one was there.
But lying on the welcome mat was an object that didn't belong, a small wooden sleigh bell, dark with age and stained red. Emily picked it up, her fingers brushing the odd discoloration.
"What is this?" James returned, holding a flashlight.
He frowned at the bell.
"A prank? Maybe one of the neighbor's kids?" Lucy closed the door quickly. "I don't like this. Let's just stay inside. The storm'll pass soon."
But the storm didn't pass.
If anything, it grew worse.
The wind screamed against the windows, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the snow. The power remained out, plunging the Stevens into a long night of unease. Hours later, as they prepared to go to bed, another sound broke the silence. This time, it was louder, a heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow. They came from the back of the house. James grabbed the flashlight and motioned for everyone to stay put.
"I'll check it out." Emily clutched Max's collar as her father disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. The minutes stretched unbearably. Finally, James's voice called out, tight and uneasy. "Lucy. Emily. You need to see this."
They found him standing at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The glass was fogged with frost, but through it, they could see what James was staring at. In the snow, just beyond the porch, was a trail of footprints leading from the woods. At the end of the trail was a snowman, eerily perfect in its construction. It wore a red scarf and a battered top hat. Its stick arms extended unnaturally long, ending in sharp, jagged points.
Lucy gasped. "Who would do this?" James shook his head. "I don't know. But those footprints, they only lead here. There's none going back."
Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather.
She couldn't look away from the snowman's face.
Its eyes were deep hollows, and its grin was wide and crooked, carved too perfectly to have been made by hand.
Max's growl turned into barking.
He lunged at the glass, his nails scraping against it as if he wanted to attack the snowman.
"That's enough, Max," James snapped, pulling him back. "We should call the police," Lucy said, her voice trembling. James hesitated.
"The phone lines are down."
"And even if they weren't, what would we say? Someone built a snowman in our yard?"
Lucy opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped when the snowman moved. Its head tilted, the grin seeming to widen. Then, with a sudden jerk, one of its stick arms slammed against the glass door, cracking it. They screamed, stumbling back as the creature, because it could no longer be called a snowman, pressed itself against the glass. The jagged stick hand scraped down the pane, leaving deep grooves.
Emily grabbed Max and bolted for the stairs. "We have to hide," she shouted. James and Lucy followed, slamming the bedroom door behind them.
They barricaded it with furniture, their breaths coming in panicked gasps.
"What was that?" Lucy whispered, clutching James's arm. "I don't know," he said. "But we're not leaving this room until morning."
Emily held Max close, her mind racing. She remembered the sleigh bell, now sitting on her bedside table. Something about it felt wrong, like it carried a weight far heavier than its size. Outside the room, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer.
The footsteps halted just outside the bedroom door.
Emily, Lucy, and James huddled together, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Even Max, usually fearless, trembled against Emily's side, a low whimper escaping him. The door handle jiggled. Lucy stifled a scream, clutching James's arm. He motioned for silence, holding a lamp in his hand as a makeshift weapon. Emily's eyes darted to the sleigh bell on the table, its strange red stain glinting faintly in the candlelight.
Then came the whisper.
A guttural, sing-song voice seeped through the cracks of the door. It was chillingly melodic, carrying the tune of an old Christmas carol but twisted into something malevolent.
"Oh, bring us some figgy pudding, and bring it right here."
The last word stretched into a growl, followed by a sharp, splintering crack as the creature began to scratch at the wood with what sounded like claws.
The scraping noise sent shivers down Emily's spine.
She clutched Max tighter.
"It's trying to get in,"
Lucy whispered harshly, her voice cracking. James looked around, his mind racing.
"We have to get out of here." "Maybe we can."
The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. It was almost worse than the noise. The three of them exchanged nervous glances, frozen in place. And then a loud crash came from downstairs. The sound of breaking glass reverberated through the house, followed by heavy thuds. Whatever it was no longer at the door.
It was inside. James motioned toward the window.
"We'll climb out and head for the car."
Lucy hesitated. "But the storm."
"It's better than staying here," he said firmly.
Emily moved quickly to grab her coat and boots. As she did, her gaze lingered on the sleigh bell.
On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she grabbed it and shoved it into her pocket. The family pushed open the window, the icy wind biting at their faces.
James climbed out first, helping Lucy and Emily down.
Max leaped after them, his paws sinking into the snow. The storm was relentless, the snow nearly up to their knees. Visibility was low, but James led the way toward the driveway where their car was parked. But when they reached it, their hope crumbled. The car was buried under a mountain of snow, far more than could have accumulated naturally. The windshield was shattered, and the tires were slashed. Long, jagged claw marks ran along the sides of the vehicle. Lucy covered her mouth, her eyes wide.
"What do we do now?"
A shrill laugh echoed through the storm, freezing them in their tracks. It was high-pitched and inhuman, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once.
James turned, gripping the lamp like a weapon. We head for the neighbors. It's our only chance.
They began to trudge through the snow, their progress slow and arduous.
The laughter followed them, growing louder and more manic.
Emily glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding. Through the swirling snow, she thought she saw a figure, tall and spindly, with glowing hollow eyes.
"Dad," she choked out. "It's coming."
James quickened his pace, urging them forward.
Max barked fiercely, but even he seemed unsure of his bravery. The family reached the edge of their property, where the woods loomed dark and foreboding. "Stay close," James said, leading them into the trees.
The thick canopy above offered some shelter from the storm, but it also cast deep shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. As they moved deeper into the forest, the laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sounds were their labored breaths and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Emily's pocket felt unnaturally warm. She pulled out the sleigh bell, frowning at it.
The red stain seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. She stopped, staring at it.
"Emily, keep moving," James called, his voice tense.
"Wait," she said, her voice shaking. This bell. It's doing something."
James and Lucy turned to look at her, confusion and fear etched on their faces. Before anyone could speak, the bell emitted a low, resonant hum. The sound vibrated through the air, causing the trees around them to creak and groan.
Max whimpered, pressing against Emily's leg. "What's happening?" Lucy whispered.
The snow at their feet shifted, swirling unnaturally. From the ground emerged long, skeletal arms made of ice and snow, clawing toward them.
The family screamed, scrambling backward as the arms reached for their legs. Emily gripped the bell tightly, desperation overtaking her fear.
On instinct, she shook it. The clear, crisp chime rang out, cutting through the chaos. The skeletal arms recoiled, retreating back into the ground.
The forest fell silent once more. What was that?" Lucy stammered.
Emily stared at the bell, her hand trembling.
"I don't know, but it's like this thing can hurt it." James stepped closer, his expression grim. "Then we keep it with us. Let's go."
They pressed on, the bell clutched tightly in Emily's hand. But as they neared the edge of the woods, the laughter returned, louder and more frenzied than before. The figure appeared again, stepping out from the shadows.
It was taller now, its spindly limbs impossibly long.
The grin carved into its face seemed to stretch wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth.
Emily didn't wait for it to move. She rang the bell again, the sound piercing the night.
The figure flinched, its grin faltering. But instead of retreating, it let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged toward them. Emily barely had time to react as the creature lunged forward, its grotesque limbs cutting through the air like knives. She shook the bell frantically, the sharp, clear chime slicing through the storm. The creature shrieked, faltering mid-attack as if struck by an unseen force.
"Run!"
James shouted, pulling Lucy to her feet.
The family sprinted through the snow, weaving between the trees.
Max barked, darting ahead to lead the way. Behind them, the creature regained its footing, its piercing howl echoing through the woods. Emily's lungs burned from the cold air, but she didn't dare slow down. The sleigh bell felt like a molten weight in her hand, growing hotter with each step. It pulsed with an unnatural energy, resonating with the rhythm of her racing heart. The woods thinned as they neared the neighbor's property, a small farmhouse perched on the hill. Its windows glowed faintly, promising refuge. Relief surged through Emily, but it was short-lived. The creature's laughter returned, this time deeper and more guttural. It was closer than she'd thought.
We're almost there, James urged, his voice tight with fear. Just as the house came into full view, a massive shadow descended from the trees, landing between them and the farmhouse. The creature loomed over them, its body writhing and shifting like a living snowstorm. Its hollow eyes burned with malevolence, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Lucy screamed, clutching James. Emily's hands trembled as she raised the bell. She rang it once, the sound cutting through the night. The creature recoiled, its grin faltering, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow angrier, its form solidifying into something even more monstrous. "Emily!" James shouted. "Do it again." She rang the bell a second time, but the chime wasn't as sharp. The heat from the bell grew unbearable, searing her palm. With a cry of pain, she dropped it into the snow. "No!" Lucy gasped. The creature's grin widened as it stepped closer, its jagged limbs reaching for them. Max barked furiously, placing himself between the family and the monster. Emily fell to her knees, scrambling for the bell. Her fingers brushed its surface, now buried in the snow, but it was too hot to grasp. Desperation clawed at her chest. Suddenly, Max lunged, sinking his teeth into the creature's leg. The monster let out a deafening roar, swiping at the dog with one of its jagged arms. Max yelped and was thrown aside, landing in a heap several feet away. "Max!" Emily screamed. The distraction gave James enough time to act. He grabbed a fallen branch, its end jagged and sharp, and charged at the creature. With all his strength, he drove the branch into its torso. The creature howled, crashing violently as snow and ice exploded from its body. "Emily, now!" James shouted. Ignoring the pain, Emily seized the bell with both hands. It burned her skin, but she held on, lifting it high. With a final, desperate effort, she rang it as hard as she could. The sound wasn't a chime this time. It was a deafening roar, a wave of energy that rippled through the forest. The creature screamed, its form dissolving into a whirlwind of snow and ice. The storm around them intensified, blinding them with its fury. When the wind finally died down, the creature was gone. The woods were silent once more, save for their ragged breaths. Emily dropped the bell, her hands red and blistered. James rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's over," he said, though his voice wavered. Lucy knelt beside Max, who lay motionless in the snow. Tears streamed down her face as she checked him for signs of life. "He's breathing," she whispered, relief washing over her. The farmhouse door creaked open, and an elderly man stepped out, holding a lantern. His face was lined with worry. "What in God's name is going on out here?" he asked, his voice shaking. James helped Lucy carry Max as they approached the man. Emily lagged behind, staring at the sleigh bell where it lay in the snow. Despite everything, it still looked ordinary, a simple, tarnished bell. But she knew better. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Harold, ushered the family into his farmhouse, his face pale with concern. Inside, the warmth of a roaring fire enveloped them, but it did little to ease the icy terror that clung to their minds. Harold handed out blankets and cups of steaming tea, his hands trembling as he listened to their story. "I've lived here for 50 years, Harold said, his voice low, "and I've heard rumors about strange things in these woods, especially around Christmas. But I never believed them." "What kind of rumors?" Emily asked, her blistered hands cradling the warm cup. Max lay on a blanket near the fire, his breathing steady but labored. Harold hesitated. "They say there's something that hunts in the snow, an old spirit, angry and vengeful. It's drawn to things that disturb the balance of the season. Like greed, hatred, or violence." His gaze lingered on the sleigh bell, which now sat on the table, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly in the firelight. Emily shivered. The bell. It's connected to all of this, isn't it? Harold nodded. A long time ago, it belonged to someone who wasn't entirely human. They say it holds their power, but also their curse. Whoever rings it invites their attention. James clenched his fists. So how do we stop it? How do we make sure it doesn't come back? Harold's face darkened. You can't destroy it. But there's a way to send it back where it came from. The bell must be taken to the heart of the storm, the place where its power is strongest. There, you can perform a ritual to banish it. But it won't be easy. The spirit will do everything it can to stop you. Silence fell over the room. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Finally, Emily spoke. We have to try. We can't let it hurt anyone else. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. But it's so dangerous. What if we don't make it? James put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll make it. Together. Harold retrieved an old, weathered book from a shelf and flipped through its pages. He stopped at a diagram of the sleigh bell, surrounded by strange symbols. You'll need to follow these instructions. The storm's center is likely near the clearing deep in the woods. That's where it's strongest. Emily studied the page, her resolve hardening. We'll do it. Tell us everything we need to know. Bundled in coats and armed with the book, the family ventured back into the storm, leaving Max behind to recover under Harold's watchful eye. The snow fell heavier than ever, and the wind howled like a living thing. Emily clutched the bell tightly, its warmth seeping through her gloves. The woods seemed darker, more sinister. Every shadow seemed to move, and every gust of wind carried whispers. James led the way, holding a lantern that barely penetrated the swirling snow. Lucy stayed close to Emily, her hand gripping her sister's arm tightly. Do you hear that? Lucy whispered. Emily nodded. The laughter was back, faint but unmistakable. It came from all directions, mocking and cruel. Keep moving, James urged, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. They reached the clearing Harold had described. It was a circle of trees, their branches twisted and blackened as if scorched by fire. In the center, the snow swirled unnaturally, forming a vortex that reached into the sky. The air was thick with an electric charge, and the bell in Emily's hand began to vibrate. This is it, she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. James opened the book, shielding its pages from the wind. Start the ritual. I'll keep watch. Emily knelt in the snow, arranging the symbols from the book using sticks and ash she'd brought from Harold's fireplace. Lucy helped, her hands shaking as she traced the lines. The bell grew hotter, almost too hot to hold. The laughter grew louder, accompanied by the sound of crunching snow. James turned, his lantern casting a feeble glow into the darkness. Shapes moved between the trees, not one, but many. It's not just one spirit, he said, his voice tight. There's more. The first creature stepped into the clearing. It was smaller than the one they'd faced earlier but no less terrifying. Its eyes glowed with the same malevolence, and its grin was just as jagged. Behind it, others emerged, each twisted and unique, like a nightmare brought to life. Hurry! James shouted, raising his branch-turned spear. Emily placed the bell in the center of the symbols and began to chant the words from the book. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. The wind grew fiercer, whipping around them in a frenzy. The creatures advanced, their hollow eyes fixed on the bell. James swung his makeshift weapon, keeping them at bay. Lucy joined him, wielding a heavy stick she'd found. But for every creature they struck down, another took its place. The bell's vibrations intensified, emitting a low,
resonant hum that seemed to anger the creatures.
One of them lunged at Emily, its clawed hand outstretched.
James intercepted it, driving his spear into its chest. The creature dissolved into snow, but another leaped forward, knocking him to the ground.
"Dad!" Emily screamed.
Lucy swung her stick, striking the creature and giving James a chance to get back up. But the creatures were relentless, closing in from all sides.
Emily's chanting reached a crescendo. The symbols around the bell glowed with an eerie light, and the snow beneath it began to melt. The vortex in the center of the clearing intensified, pulling the creatures toward it. They clawed at the ground, screeching in fury. "It's working!" Lucy cried. The largest creature appeared, stepping into the clearing with deliberate menace. It was the same one they'd faced earlier, its form more solid and terrifying than before.
Its eyes locked onto Emily, and it lunged. Emily screamed, but before the creature could reach her, James tackled it, the two of them crashing into the snow.
"Finish it!"
James shouted, struggling to hold the creature back.
Emily rang the bell one final time.
The sound was deafening, a piercing note that seemed to split the air itself. The vortex erupted with light, pulling the creatures into its center. They screamed, their forms disintegrating as they were dragged into the void. The largest creature thrashed violently, throwing James aside.
It reached for Emily, its hollow eyes burning with rage. But the vortex's pull was too strong.
With one last, furious howl, it was consumed, vanishing into the light.
And then, silence.
The storm stopped, the wind died, and the woods were still. Emily collapsed to the ground, the bell falling from her hand.
Its glow faded, leaving it cold and ordinary once more.
Lucy helped James to his feet, tears streaming down her face.
They embraced, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Emily joined them, the three of them holding each other tightly. In the distance, the faint glow of Harold's farmhouse beckoned them home. The family stumbled back to Harold's farmhouse, each step heavier than the last.
The bell's once oppressive weight was now a memory, but its presence lingered in Emily's mind like a haunting whisper. When they reached the door, Harold opened it with a look of relief that quickly turned to alarm at the sight of their battered forms.
"You're alive," he said, ushering them inside. "Thank God."
The warmth of the fire enveloped them once again, but it was a fragile comfort. Max wagged his tail weakly from his spot by the hearth, and Lucy rushed to him, cradling his head and whispering reassurances. Harold pressed mugs of tea into their hands, but no one spoke for several minutes. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air like a storm cloud. Finally, Harold broke the silence.
"Did it work?" James nodded, his voice hoarse. "It's gone."
"At least, we think it is." The storm stopped. Harold exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "You did what few others have managed. That thing, it's been tormenting this area for generations.
But its hold is strongest during the season. You gave us peace, at least for now."
Emily set her untouched mug down and stared at the bell, now resting on the table.
It looked so harmless, its tarnished surface glinting faintly in the firelight.
But she knew its true nature, and the thought of it existing even in a dormant state made her stomach churn.
"We can't keep it here," she said firmly. "Not after everything."
Harold nodded gravely.
"It needs to be hidden, somewhere it can't be found." James frowned. "But what if someone stumbles on it by accident? We thought it was a harmless trinket. Who knows what could happen if it's found again?"
"There's one place it can go," Harold said after a moment. "A place where it will stay buried and forgotten.
Deep in the woods, beneath the old chapel. No one's gone there in decades. It's consecrated ground. The spirit's influence can't reach there. Emily hesitated, her gaze fixed on the bell. A part of her wanted to destroy it, to crush it beneath her boot and scatter its pieces. But Harold's words echoed in her mind, "You can't destroy it." "We'll do it tomorrow," James said, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "For now, let's rest." The next morning dawned unnaturally still, the woods blanketed in pristine snow. The family, accompanied by Harold, made their way to the old chapel. Max stayed behind, still too weak to join them. The journey was somber, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the snow. The chapel was a crumbling structure, its stone walls covered in ivy and frost. Inside, the air was cold but oddly peaceful. Harold led them to the altar, where a small trapdoor revealed a hidden compartment beneath the floor. "Place it here," Harold instructed. "Once it's sealed, it will stay buried. The consecration will keep it dormant." Emily knelt, holding the bell one last time. It felt different now, cold and inert, but still ominous. With a deep breath, she set it inside the compartment. Harold closed the trapdoor and muttered a prayer, tracing a symbol over the wood. "It's done," he said, his voice heavy with finality. The family stood in silence, the weight of their ordeal settling over them. They had survived, but the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain. The drive home was quiet. The woods seemed less menacing, the snow more serene. As they pulled into their driveway, Lucy spoke for the first time in hours. "Do you think it's really gone?" she asked, her voice small. Emily looked at her sister, then at James. "Maybe not forever. But for now, yes. We stopped it." That night, as they sat by the fire with Max curled at their feet, Emily allowed herself a small moment of peace. The bell was gone, and the storm had passed. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Far beneath the chapel, the bell sat in its dark, confined space. Its surface was cold, its chime silent. But if one listened closely, past the layers of earth and stone, a faint, mocking laughter could be heard, waiting.